Well, welcome to the next in the series of our real estate rundown. My name is Andrew Jones. I'm a partner at Wright Hassall in the real estate team. Commercial real estate is my area. I'm joined today by my partner, Mike Hiscock, who is the head of our construction team. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Andy.
So today I wanted to talk about construction contracts, something you deal with a lot on a day-to-day basis. So let's start at the basics. What is a construction contract?
A construction contract is, to a certain extent, what you'd expect it to be in terms of the usual operations for building, for buildings, for land, for things that you put in buildings, repair and maintenance, systems in buildings, electrical, heating, air conditioning, ventilation, all the things that go around that, including demolition, including maintenance, and all the professional surveying and architecture and design professional agreements that go with that. So what you've got is a contract for the delivery of construction operations. But it's worth noting a couple of points around construction contracts. So it's important to understand what are not statutory construction contracts as well. So construction operations and construction contracts are governed by what we refer to as the Construction Act, which has a long definition of what construction contracts are. But if you are a consumer, the Act doesn't apply. So what we're not talking about today is consumer contracts, because consumers have added rights elsewhere in the Consumer Rights Act.
So this is commercial, business
So this
to
is
business.
commercial, business to business. And there are a couple of other exclusions. So for example, what I would call statutory agreements are not covered. So Section 106 planning agreements, Section 38 highways agreements, 278, they're not construction contracts. And the final thing, just to mention, that catches people out sometimes, are agreements which include provisions for disposal of an interest in land.
Okay, so if I was a landlord and I said, you can have this lease, but I'm going to do these works beforehand, that might be an example of exclusion?
Yes, so if it's all in the same agreement, then it's not a construction contract. But sometimes you see situations where you have two separate agreements, one for the transfer of the interest in land, one for the development obligations. So that would pull you back into a construction contract.
So the main time you'd have this is, I'm a business, I need a new building, and I go out and find a contractor to build me a new building that I can operate from. That's a classic example.
That's absolutely right.
So in that sort of scenario, let's just have a quick chat about the main sort of terms of that contract. So let's start with payment. How does that work?
Payment is really important in light of current difficulties in the construction industry, and it's very important in construction contracts to have an adequate payment mechanism. And what we mean by an adequate payment mechanism is provisions for understanding how much is going to be paid, when it becomes due, which means it's actionable and people can pursue it, and what the final date for payment is, which means when the money actually moves across.
Is that completely flexible? Is that something the parties can negotiate, or are there some rules around minimum standards around payment?
There are some rules that the Act implies in terms of minimum payment mechanisms. So you have to be able to work out with certainty how much you're claiming for payment and when that actually becomes due. And then there is a certain order of events that happens afterwards. The right notices have to be given at the right time so people understand exactly what they can claim.
So that helps cash flow, presumably, for both sides. So if I'm a particularly tight businessman and I don't want to pay you until right at the end, then I probably can't do that.
You can agree between two commercial businesses what the final date for payment is. So if you can agree 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, as long as there's certainty about what that looks like for both businesses, that's fine.
Okay, great. And I'm also a very demanding person, so I need to have this building up and running, within the next 6 months. What happens regarding timeframes and delays with the contractor? Can I put a penalty on you if you don't deliver, for example?
There are two options for dealing with delays in construction contracts. You can leave the contract silent on that. And then you get into a situation where you have to prove the loss that has been suffered as a result of that delay. But most of the time, parties prefer certainty. So we get into a situation of using liquidated damages, which is a pre-agreed amount that can be deducted at source if the contractor is late. The test for that has changed though, and listeners to this might be familiar with the old test of what is a genuine pre-estimate of loss. Okay. So when you're trying to work out that number to put in the contract, how many pounds per week can I deduct if the contractor is late?
Sorry, Mike, go on.
The old test was a pre-agreed genuine pre-estimate of loss. Now there's a lot more flexibility for commercial businesses to incentivise to a certain extent. So the law and the judges have recognised that there's some incentive and some commercial dynamic going on with that. So what you're now looking at is a test of whether that number was out of all proportion to the interest in getting the building finished.
So if I've got a contract and I need to deliver on that contract and it's going to cost me, tens of thousands of pounds if I'm late on that, you could sort of build that into the contract in some way.
That's exactly right. You can factor in the wider commercial context to make sure that the contractor stays focused on what they're required to do.
Okay, great. And the design itself, I want this factory or whatever it might be to look a certain way. How can I make sure that you as the contractor are building it in that way?
The key risk for design at the moment is fitness for purpose. So insurance requirements would expect to see wording around reasonable skill and care. The legal risk comes in when that becomes a fitness for purpose requirement. And listeners who might have seen the JCT 2024 will see in there a paragraph that specifically excludes fitness for purpose, because that causes insurers a great deal of difficulty, because you have to judge architects and engineers and other designers against the standards of their profession, and what would a professional designer in those circumstances do. The other issue is who takes the responsibility for that design. So often in design and build contracts, the first part of the design is completed and people crystallise what they want to achieve and what type of building it is, but they hand that design over to the contractor and the subcontractors to work out the detail of how they're going to deliver that design.
So there's a multiple team working on this. This office, there's an architect who then passes that over to a builder who then uses subcontractors. So it's not just you and me, as it were, doing this build. There's a team of people, as I understand it.
There's a team of people, and a common discussion is who takes responsibility. How do we set up the contracts in the right way to make sure that people are protected in terms of carrying that design liability and what they're responsible for delivering?
Great. As a property lawyer, we often talk about practical completion. It's a really important date, but what does it actually mean, Mike?
Practical completion is one of those things where it's easier to see than define. It's what typical, you'll know it when you see it in scenario. It's become the subject of a lot of case law, and the judges are talking about a very high standard. Practical completion means a really high standard of completion where there are only trifling issues, only minor little bits and pieces, a sticking door handle, a light switch that doesn't work. The test at the moment is more about, can the building be used properly to a high standard for the purposes that it was intended to be delivered. And the key interrelationship with property agreements is what conditions for the end user are required. So where you do see the concept of practical completion defined is where there's a purchaser or a tenant and they need to have specific information given to them. So you might see practical completion conditional on delivery of certain documents, approval of certain consents, and that is where it can become relevant to define the concept of practical completion.
So practically you could move into it, but if you haven't got the right consent, planning permission, building regulation or something like that, or there's a condition that hasn't been fulfilled, then there's an argument as to whether you can use the building or not, I suppose.
And that is where sometimes you see the definition of practical completion to say, actually, I know that I've got a tenant and they need to have certain certificates and certain manuals to use the building. So I'm going to make that a condition of the building contract, so the contractor has to deliver that information.
So what's a snagging list then?
A A snagging list is really to cover those really minor points, to go around after practical completion when the building's in occupation and to just tidy up loose ends effectively.
Okay, so it doesn't stop practical completion. It's almost an acknowledgement that we've got to sort these bits and pieces out, these minor issues out, but you can still move in and use the building.
Yes, buildings are a big, complicated, multi-system projects, and there's always going to be little bits and pieces, but the standard of practical completion is still quite high. You don't hand it over until it's really in good shape.
Right. So what happens if I'm halfway through the project and I change my mind and I want you to build, the contractor to build something slightly different? Have I got any rights to change my mind?
You can issue instructions for variations and changes, and that is a common area which allows clients to make decisions as the project goes on. The positive side of that is there's change control, so there's interaction with the people involved, the design team, the builder, to understand whether that change is possible, how long it would take, how much it would cost to do. The downside is the more changes you make, the more risk you assume, because you're telling the builder to deliver a slightly different product to the original plan. So it does become quite complicated if you haven't really crystallised at the beginning essentially what you want from your building.
Well, there must be cost implications for both parties.
There are cost and time implications for both parties, and you often have to bring along the end user with that to determine exactly whether it's achievable at all, and if so, how long and how much.
Yeah, okay. And what if there's an issue between the business and the contractor, and they fall out and they want to change contractors part way through or change some of the team? Is there any rights to cancel and start again?
It's all about what you put in the contract. So the general English principle is I've started, so I'll finish.
Like Mastermind?
So, like Mastermind. So a party should be allowed to complete the job that they've been engaged to do, unless you've written in the contract grounds for termination.
Okay.
So there could be termination, you're not giving the right information at the right time, you're not working together in the right way, you're not making decisions, circumstances which make the job unachievable, or you're not paying on time, so you're persistently paying late and the job becomes unworkable, are typical grounds for allowing contractual termination.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the industry is trying to push the boundaries a little bit, which I think is really unfair in terms of just allowing termination by choice. I've actually don't wish to work with you anymore and I want to go and find someone else. But it all comes down to what you've written in the contract and what you're allowed to do.
Okay. If there is a dispute partway through the build or even at the end of the build, how do I resolve that either as a contractor who hasn't been paid maybe, or a building that's been delivered that isn't what I was expecting? Do I have to go through the courts to resolve that?
If you have a construction contract as defined in the Act, then it brings in this concept of adjudication, which is a specialist dispute process aimed at the construction industry, set up in the mid-90s and conceived as a way of keeping cash moving down through the industry. It allows for quick decisions, it allows for active management while the job is ongoing, so we can still get the building finished and built, and in parallel making some quick decisions about whose responsibility is the issue, who should be paid, whether they've done the job properly in the right way. So adjudication is a 28-day process where you can bring in a third party to give you a relatively quick decision that allows progress on the job. So mediation is a really useful tool where you can sit down and have a facilitated discussion, but that is subject to the parties being willing to meet, discuss, negotiate, come to a conclusion. And sometimes,
so that's voluntary then, mediation?
It's voluntary.
Or can you write that into the contract? I suppose if the parties aren't really engaged in it, it's not going to work.
You do sometimes see in contracts a tiered dispute mechanism. So sometimes contracts will say, first of all, go to the managing directors, see if they can work it out, then go to mediation and see if you can talk around a table. Then, if all else fails, go to a formal process. So you could go to court. Courts are really expensive, courts take a long time, but in the construction sector you have this extra process of adjudication which takes you into effectively a 1 month quick decision which can be enforced, and you only then can challenge it in very, very limited circumstances.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Mike. Probably the last point really for me was on collateral warranties. I've heard about them. As brief as you can. What are they, and how does insurance sort of sit alongside warranties?
Collateral warranties are one of those things that everybody has heard about and everybody wants, but rarely get used, and they are effectively a safety net. So you have a principle in English law of privity of contract, where the only two people that can use the contract are the parties to that contract. Collateral warranties create a contractual link where there wasn't one already. So a bank might want a collateral warranty, a purchaser might want a collateral warranty, because their direct relationships are only through the funding agreement, only through the sale agreement. But they might want the ability to step in and take over the building construction process. So if the developer goes bust, for example, or the developer walks away, the purchaser or the bank might choose to say, actually, this building's nearly finished, I'm going to step in here and finish the job. Alternatively, a couple of years after practical completion, there's a serious problem with the building, the developer's walked away, and the purchaser says, who can I blame? Who actually designed and built this? And have I got a contractual link to them to be able to run that claim and recover some of the money from this defect in this building? So collateral warranties can be quite useful in limited circumstances, and they're effectively a secondary safety net in the form of a document. There is a statutory mechanism, the Contracts Rights of Third Parties Act, which does allow you to name parties at the beginning to make people aware that I am selling this building to a supermarket chain. But you might not necessarily know that in the context of a warehouse or an office or a standard building that could have multiple uses. So the collateral warranty becomes useful later on as an insurance-backed document, which effectively makes a promise and says, I promised under the main building contract that I would deliver you that building in that way. I'm promising to the purchaser that I've done the right job in the right way, and you can come back and blame me if I haven't done my job properly.
Great. No, that's really useful, Mike. Thanks for that rundown on construction contracts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.